Chapter 15 of Recollections of the Civil War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Denise Nordell. Recollections of the Civil War by Charles Dana. Chapter 15. The March on Petersburg. In camp at Cold Harbor. Grant's opinion of Lee. Trouble with newspaper correspondents. Moving south of the James River. The Great Pontoon Bridge. The fighting of the colored troops. Failure to take Petersburg at first attack. Lee loses Grant and Beauregard finds him. Beauregard's service to the Confederacy. The affair of June 3d at Cold Harbor showed that Lee was not to be driven from his position without a great sacrifice of life. A left flank movement south of the James River was accordingly decided upon by Grant. This was no new idea; that eventuality had been part of the original plan of campaign, and preparations for bridging the James had been ordered as early as the 15th of April, 3 weeks before the Battle of the Wilderness. One object of the movement across the James was to cut off Richmond's line of supplies from the south. But before this could be done another matter had to be attended to. In General Grant's plan of campaign, the effectual destruction of the Virginia Central Railroad was an indispensable feature. In moving from Culpeper he had expected that before reaching the Chickahominy he would have a chance to crush Lee's army by fighting. This would have allowed him an undisturbed opportunity to destroy that road, as well as the Fredericksburg road from the Chickahominy to the North Anna. The expectation had been disappointed by Lee's success in avoiding a decisive battle. Before moving farther in accomplishing the great object of the campaign, these roads must be so thoroughly destroyed that when Richmond was cut off from other lines of communication with the South, the attempt to repair and use the line through Gordonsville and Lynchburg would be hopeless. The work was first to be attempted by Sheridan with cavalry. If he was not able to complete it, the whole army was to be swung around for the purpose, even should it be necessary to abandon temporarily our communications with White House. This necessity, as well as that of making thorough preparations for the difficult march south of the James and for the perfect cooperation of Butler at Bermuda Hundred, detained Grant at Cold Harbor until June 12th. Two officers of his staff, Colonel Comstock and Colonel Porter, had been sent to General Butler to arrange for cooperation in the movement of the army to Bermuda Hundred, and to look over the ground to be traversed and the means of crossing the river. Grant would not order the movement until they returned. They did not get back until the 12th. During this time the opposing lines of Grant and Lee were very close together, and on our side the troops made regular siege approaches to the Confederate works. The days passed quietly, with no fighting except an occasional rattle of musketry and now and then a cannon shot. There was occasionally a scare on the line. On the evening of June 5th, Wright's and Hancock's line responded to a stiff assault. The firing lasted for 20 minutes, and it was very loud, but it was all about nothing, and no harm was done. The enemy were so near that in the dark our men thought they were coming out to attack. On June 6th there was an onslaught on Burnside just after midnight, which was successfully repulsed, and in the afternoon a rush was made by a party of 100 picked men of the enemy, who came to find out what was the meaning of Hancock's advancing siege lines. As a rule, everything was quiet except the picket firing, which could not be prevented when the men were so close together. The picket firing ceased only during the occasional truces to bury the dead. The operations around Cold Harbor, the close proximity of the two lines, the unceasing firing, with no hour in the day or night when one could not hear the sound of musketry and cannon, were precisely like the conditions at Spotsylvania and those on the North Anna. It was a constant feeling for the weak spot in Lee's armor. There was far less maneuvering at Cold Harbor after the first efforts than during the long struggle at Spotsylvania. We were merely waiting for the proper moment to withdraw toward the James. Grant, Meade, and all the leading officers were certain of ultimate success. Although the fighting had been more severe and continuous than anything in the previous history of the army, I must say a cheerful, confident tone generally prevailed. All acted as if they were at a job which required only time to finish. Grant was disappointed and talked to me a good deal about the failure to get at Lee in an open battle which would wind up the Confederacy. The general was constantly revolving plans to turn Lee out of his intrenchments. The old-time fear of Lee's superior ability that was rife among the officers of the Army of the Potomac had entirely disappeared. They had begun to look upon him as an ordinary mortal, making a fairly good effort to ward off fate, and nothing more. I think Grant respected Lee's military ability and character, yet the boldness with which he maneuvered in Lee's presence is proof that he was not overawed by Lee's prestige as a strategist and tactician. He thought Lee's great forte was as a defensive fighter, a quality displayed at Antietam and Fredericksburg, but held no high opinion of his Chancellorsville operations, where he had recklessly laid himself open to ruin. To me the views of the military men at the different headquarters were interesting and instructive. While we were encamped at Cold Harbor, General Meade was very much disturbed by a letter published in a Cincinnati paper, saying that after the Battle of the Wilderness he counseled retreat, a course which would have destroyed the nation, but which Grant prohibited. This was entirely untrue. Meade had not shown any weakness since moving from Culpeper, nor once intimated doubt as to the successful issue of the campaign. Nor had he intimated that any other plan or line would be more likely to win. The newspaper correspondent who was responsible for the misstatement was with us, and Meade ordered that, as a punishment, he should be paraded through the lines and afterward expelled from the army. This was done on June 8th, the correspondent being led through the army on horseback by the provost marshal guard. On his back and breast were tacked placards inscribed, "Libeller of the Press." It was not often, considering the conditions, that correspondents got into trouble in the army. As a rule, they were discreet. Besides this case of Meade, I remember now only one other in which I was actively interested. This was a few months later, after I had returned to the department. Mr. Stanton had been annoyed by a telegram which had been published about Sherman's movements, and he ordered me to send it to the general, so that we might know how much truth there was in it. I wired him as follows: War Department, November 9, 1864. Major General Sherman, Kingston, Georgia. Following, copied from evening papers, is sent for your information. Cincinnati, November 9, 1864. Yesterday's Indianapolis Journal says, "Officers from Chattanooga report that Sherman returned to Atlanta early last week with 5 corps of his army, leaving 2 corps at Tennessee to watch Hood. He destroyed the railroad from Chattanooga to Atlanta, and is sending the iron into the former place. Atlanta was burned, and Sherman is now marching for Charleston, South Carolina." Sherman sent back 2 characteristic dispatches. The first ran: Kingston, Georgia, November 10, 1864. Hon. C. A. Dana. Dispatch of 9th read: "Can't you send to Indianapolis and catch that fool and have him sent to me to work on the forts? All well. W. T. Sherman, Major General." The second: Kingston, Georgia, November 10, 1864. Hon. C. A. Dana, Assistant Secretary of War. If indiscreet newspaper men publish information too near the truth, counteract its effect by publishing other paragraphs calculated to mislead the enemy, such as: "Sherman's army has been reinforced, especially in the cavalry, and he will soon move several columns in circuit, so as to catch Hood's army. Sherman's destination is not Charleston, but Selma, where he will meet an army from the Gulf," etc. W. T. Sherman, Major General. So I telegraphed to Indianapolis to General A. P. Hovey, who was stationed there: War Department, November 10, 1864. Major General A. P. Hovey, Indianapolis. In compliance with the request of Major General Sherman, the Secretary of War directs that you ascertain what persons furnished the information respecting Sherman's alleged movement published in the Indianapolis Journal on the 8th instant. You will arrest them and send them under guard to such point in the Department of the Cumberland as Major General Thomas may prefer, where they will be employed in hard labor upon the fortifications until General Sherman shall otherwise order. General Hovey never found the man, however. By the morning of the 12th of June, Grant was ready for his last flank movement of the campaign. Our army at that time, including Sheridan's cavalry, consisted of approximately 115,000 fighting men. The plan for moving this great body was as follows: The 18th Corps was to move to White House without baggage or artillery, and there embark for City Point. The 5th Corps was to cross the Chickahominy at Long Bridge, and take a position to secure the passage of the remainder of the army, after which it was to cover the rear. The 2nd, 6th, and 9th Corps were to cross in 2 columns at Long Bridge and Jones's Bridge. At first it had been hoped, if not opposed by the enemy in force, to strike James River immediately opposite Bermuda Hundred; if resisted, then lower down, where General Butler had been ordered to throw a bridge across and to corduroy the approaches. The 5th Corps having prepared the way, the whole army left the lines about Cold Harbor on schedule time, just as soon after nightfall on the 12th as its movements could be concealed from the observation of the enemy. It was in drawing orders for such complicated movements as these, along different roads and by different crossings, that the ability of General Humphreys, the Chief of Staff, was displayed. Everything went perfectly from the start. That evening at 7 o'clock, when I reached Moody's, 4 miles from Long Bridge, the 5th Corps, Warren's, was moving rapidly past us. Our cavalry advance, under General Wilson, who had also been transferred to the east, had previously taken Long Bridge and laid a pontoon bridge in readiness for the crossing, so that by 9 o'clock that evening the Fifth Corps was south of the Chickahominy, well out toward the approaches from Richmond, and covering them. All day the 13th the army was hurrying toward the James. By night the Sixth Corps had reached the river, and the rest of the troops were on the march between there and the Chickahominy, which was our rear. When I reached the James early the next day, the 14th, large numbers of men were hard at work on the pontoon bridge and its approaches, by which it was intended that the artillery and trains should cross. It was a pretty heavy job to corduroy the marsh, which was fully half a mile wide and quite deep. The bridge itself was unprecedented in military annals, except perhaps by that of Xerxes, being nearly 700 yards long. All day on the 14th everything went like a miracle. The pontoon bridge was finished at 2 o'clock the next morning, and the cavalry of Wilson's leading brigade, followed by the artillery trains, instantly began crossing. By 10 o'clock on the 15th, Hancock's corps had been ferried over, and he was off toward Petersburg to support Smith, who had taken the 18th Corps around by water from the White House, and had been ordered to attack Petersburg that morning. All the news we had that night at City Point, where headquarters had been set up, was that Smith had assaulted and carried the principal line of the enemy before Petersburg. The next morning early I was off for the heights southeast of the town. Smith's success appeared to be of the most important kind. He had carried heights which were defended by very formidable works. He thought, and indeed we all thought for the moment, that his success gave us perfect command of the city and railroad. I went over the conquered lines with General Grant and the engineer officers, and they all agreed that the works were of the very strongest kind, more difficult even to take than Missionary Ridge at Chattanooga. General Smith told us that the Negro troops fought magnificently, the hardest fighting being done by them. The forts they stormed were, I think, the worst of all. After the affair was over, General Smith went to thank them and tell them he was proud of their courage and dash. He said they had no superiors as soldiers, and that hereafter he should send them into a difficult place as readily as the best white troops. They captured 6 out of the 16 cannons which he took. It soon appeared, however, that Smith was far from having captured points which commanded Petersburg. His success had but little effect in determining that final result. He had stopped his advance a few minutes and a considerable space too soon because, as he subsequently alleged, it was too dark and his men were too much fatigued for further operations, and he feared Lee had already reinforced the town. This turned out not to be so. Lee did not know until the 17th that Grant had crossed the James. And up to that date Lee's position was a mystery to us. We could hardly suppose he had remained at Cold Harbor. When Grant discovered exactly how much had been gained and lost, he was very much dissatisfied. There was a controversy between Hancock and Smith, subsequently, about the responsibility for this failure. On the 16th, the day after Smith's attack, more of the troops arrived before Petersburg. General Meade also arrived on the ground, and the job of capturing Petersburg was now taken up in earnest by the whole Army of the Potomac. It was no longer a mere matter of advancing 80 or 100 rods, as on the night previous, for meanwhile the enemy had been largely and rapidly reinforced. Much time and many thousands of valuable lives were to be expended in getting possession of this vital point, which had really been in our grasp on the evening of the 15th. That afternoon there began a series of assaults on the works of the enemy. The fighting lasted all night, the moonlight being very clear. Our loss was heavy. The next day, the 17th, another attack was made on Petersburg. It was persistent, but Meade found that his men were so worn out with marching, fighting, and digging that they must have rest, and so laid off until noon of the 18th, when, all of the army being up, a general assault was ordered. Nothing important was gained, and General Grant directed that no more assaults should be made. He said that after this he should maneuver to get possession of Petersburg. I saw nothing of the fighting of June 16th and 17th, being ill in camp, but the members of Grant's staff told me that our operations were unsatisfactory owing to our previous heavy loss in superior officers. The men fought as well as ever, Colonel Comstock told me, but they were not directed with the same skill and enthusiasm. While these operations were going on, I made 2 or 3 trips to the river to watch the crossing of the troops. It was an animated and inspiring sight, for the great mass of men, animals, and baggage was handled with the greatest intelligence. By the 17th our entire army was south of the James, and the bridge over the river by which the trains had crossed was taken up. During all this period, from Cold Harbor to Petersburg, we knew nothing of Lee. In making the disposition for this great and successful movement, a far more brilliant evolution than McClellan's change of base 2 years before over almost the same roads, The purpose was, of course, to deceive Lee as to the ultimate direction of the army. The design succeeded far beyond Grant's most sanguine hopes. As soon, on the morning of the 13th, as the Confederate chieftain discovered our withdrawal, he moved his army across the Chickahominy in hot haste, flinging it between his capital and the foe, supposed to be advancing on a new line between the James and the Chickahominy. He held and fortified a line from White Oak Swamp to Malvern Hill, and here he remained stock still for 4 days, wondering what had become of Grant. Lee had been completely deceived, and could not be made to believe by Beauregard on the 15th, 16th, and 17th that Grant's whole army had turned up before Petersburg. His troops, as we know now, did not cross the James to go to the relief of Beauregard until the 17th. He was caught napping, and but for mistakes by subordinates in carrying out Grant's plans, Lee's cause would have been lost. In the operations from the night of the 12th, when Grant changed his line and base, with an army of 115,000 men and all its vast trains of artillery, crossing a wide and deep river on a temporary bridge, until June 18th, when at last Lee awoke to the situation, General Beauregard shines out on the Confederate side far more brilliantly than the general in chief. He unquestionably saved Petersburg, and for the time the Confederacy. But for him, Lee had at that time lost the game. End of chapter 15. Recording by Denise Nordell, Modesto, California.